A reading from the Gospel of John. To the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free?" Jesus replied, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." The Gospel of Christ. Thanks God.
So today I'm coming to the fifth and final theme in my series on humanity created in the image of God. And so to refresh our memories, here are the first four themes that we covered earlier, and we'll see what this one's about in a moment. So, humanity as the image of God, four themes we've looked at so far. Responsibility, particularly for our world or creation. Often the word used there is stewardship. So either way, responsibility, stewardship for our world and creation. Then there's relationality. That means our capacity for relationships with God, with others, with creation, but particularly through agape love, through self-giving, self-sacrificing love. Then our rationality, our capacity for reason, reflects God's capacity for reason. We see that reason in the structure and order of the universe. And then our fourth one there is creativity, our talents to innovate and create. And so in Christian tradition, those are four human characteristics that image or reflect or mirror the nature of God. And so this morning, we're going to come to our fifth and final theme. And actually, you might remember this from a while ago. So I used all these different images. One image here, each to just trigger our memories, associations with each of those five themes. And so today we come to humanity's freedom as being in the image of God. And so there's Rodin's Thinker at the top here, reflecting our rationality. There's this gardening picture reflecting our stewardship, responsibility for creation. Creativity symbolized here, our capacity for relationships here. And this one up here, my opening slide, was protesters in Hong Kong calling for greater freedom and the rekeeping of democracy. Anyways, just some visual images there to help us associate with these five themes. And so today we come to our fifth theme, which is freedom. So, humanity's freedom as being in the image of God's own freedom. Our freedom reflecting God's own freedom. Chris, but what does that mean? What does it mean to say God is free? And why does that matter? So, one of the most important things that this means to speak of God's freedom is to say that God was free to create or not create. So, in Christian tradition, God could have chosen not to create the universe, the world, and so forth. There is no necessity within God that somehow requires God to create the universe or to create us. But God freely chose to do so, and then freely chose to love the world and the creation that he had created as well. So our freedom, therefore, somehow reflects this freedom of God. But before humanity's freedom actually comes creation's own freedom. So, before I go on to talk about humanity, say more about humanity's freedom, I'm going to talk first about the incredible creative freedom of creation itself. So God has designed the structure of creation for there to be freedom all the way up through the cosmos. From the moment of the Big Bang to the unfolding expanse of the universe, to the emergence of galaxies and planets, and to the evolutionary emergence of life on our own planet and possibly elsewhere in the universe as well. And so this is the incredible creative productivity of the universe and the incredible creativity of nature on our own planet. And this represents the freedom of natural processes that God has built into creation. It is so amazing. Well then, when it comes to us as humanity, our freedom images this freedom, but images God's freedom. Okay? And so we've heard some of these examples in Scripture this morning, scriptures we've read this morning. So John 8:32 that we just heard, the truth shall set you free. And then a few verses later, if the Son sets you free, you shall be free indeed. Then there's Luke chapter 4, where Jesus launches his ministry from the Nazareth synagogue. And so he went to Nazareth where he'd been brought up, his home synagogue. And on the Sabbath day, he went into the Nazareth synagogue and he stood up to read. And Luke chapter 4 says, the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. And unrolling it, he found the place in Isaiah where it is written, these words. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So that's how Jesus launches his ministry. And twice in there, he describes his ministry and mission as freedom. Then this morning we just heard also from Galatians chapter 5. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Now that seems kind of redundant and repetitive. But what does this mean? In other words, as Christians, we should not create excessive, burdensome rules like the oral Torah, the oral law in Jewish tradition. So the context in which Paul is talking about this is the example of just simply the burden of excessive rules in the life of the Jewish people. So Jesus himself gives an example of this in his statement that the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath needs to be observed in a way that serves people's well-being, not in a way that simply fulfills a bunch of rules. So it was for freedom that Christ set us free. Well, with these sorts of New Testament texts, then we need to ask, freedom from what? And freedom for what? So I'm actually going to open the floor for a moment and ask you just to kind of shout out. Do we need a mic? We'll see. Stephen's getting a mic. But just for now, get us thinking a bit. What are the sorts of freedoms from and freedoms for that you think of that Christ came to set us free from and free for? Any thoughts? Yusuf.
Freedom from sin.
Freedom from sin. Tell us more about that. So there's a long, yes, that's exactly, all kinds of sins, long lists of sins. Thank you, Yusuf. Yeah. Excellent. Christine.
I was thinking more along the lines of freedom from constraints, freedom from your constraints of your immediate surroundings or physical limitations.
Okay.
God is not constrained by that, and I think that's the kind of loving, benevolent freedom he wants to give to us.
Thank you, Christine. So freedom from sin, freedom constraints. Amal has?
freedom from oppression, as Jesus came to set the oppressed free.
Yeah. Absolutely. Excellent. Thank you. Fear and anxiety. Absolutely. Thank you, Fiona. Okay. Freedoms for? Oh, okay. Gregory?
Freedom to use our talents for the good of the community and others, and rather than just for our own benefit.
Excellent. Freedom to use our gifts and talents for the benefit of others. Excellent. Yep. One more.
Freedom for seeking justice.
Freedom for seeking justice. Excellent. These are great. And actually, I'll be touching on some of these in a moment. The list is wide and long, and we could keep going on this. Naming more of these freedoms from and freedoms for. And so my time this morning is limited. I'm not going to speak for more than 2 hours, so I can only say so much in that time. Or maybe a little less than 2 hours. For visitors, I'm not serious. So that means I'm going to have to constrain what I include in this morning, but we'll have time for a bit of discussion afterwards to expand on anything that I talk about this morning. So here I'm going to introduce the idea of freeing constraints. Okay? I mean, I could take this discussion in any number of directions. I happen to be thinking particularly these days in these themes, so this is the direction I'm going to take my words this morning. So there's that word that Christine gave us, freeing constraints. So this is the idea that the beauty and joy and wonder of freedom always exists within constraints. But these constraints make true freedom possible. True freedom can only exist within constraints. So we've seen some of these already. I've mentioned these already this morning. Freeing constraints on God by God's own nature. God is holy and agapic. God has restraints. God can only act in ways that conform to God's own character and nature. And then there are freeing constraints on creation by the laws of nature. So, there are also freeing constraints on us as humanity. So, these are constraints so that we don't cause harm to the world and to ourselves and to each other. So let me give you one example of a freeing constraint. So I was reading a while ago about this fellow who was describing a soccer game that he was at in high school. So this was an intramural game after school, the end of the day. And so the two teams show up, and the referee doesn't show up. And so the two teams decide to, start to play anyways. And it turns into a free-for-all. The bigger kids kind of push around the smaller kids and start to ignore the rules. And pretty soon it deteriorated into kids just dropping out because they weren't having any fun. Eventually, the referee showed up. Got them all back together. Okay, let's start this again. Started the game over, and everyone started having fun. Why was that? It was because suddenly the rules were in place that enabled the fun to happen. Too few rules, and you lose the fun. You just get frustration and so forth. Too many rules, the same thing. You get frustration and you lose the fun. Just the right balance of freedom and rules and constraints all together creates the opportunity for that fun together. So, when we expand this to elsewhere in life, there are many parts of life where we as humanity struggle with finding that right balance between freedom and constraints for our well-being. And this is one of humanity's great challenges. Just going back to Scripture, as an example. In Jewish theology, the Torah laws were celebrated as a source of life. But in the New Testament period, the Torah had become, especially the oral Torah on top of the written Torah, had become such a source of excessive restrictions and burdens on people that Jesus had to say at one point, look, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Meaning, in contrast to all the heavy rules of the oral Torah. The New Testament is also concerned with freedom from constraints of tyranny, or as Amel said, oppression. So the book of Revelation, in particular, has a vision for God's kingdom, for the new creation, for the new Jerusalem, which will be free from Roman tyranny and free for God's kingdom. So the book of Revelation, so much of it is just about freedom from that Roman tyranny. And of course, overall, we can say Jesus is concerned, and here's Yusuf's point, for freedom simply from the harms we cause ourselves through sin overall. So let me move this discussion to our context today. And I'm going to ask you to imagine a spectrum, which I'm going to call the freedom spectrum. And so here I'm moving our discussion more to this social level. I could take it any number of ways, but this is the way I'm taking it today. And on this spectrum, you see two ends. One is conformism, where there's very limited freedom, high social control, high emphasis on tradition, even tyranny. And then at the other end is individualism, high levels of freedom from social conformity, from tradition, for however one wants to live. So New Testament times, the Roman context was at that high conformism side. Social rules and rules were very rigid in society, and then political tyranny as well. In our society today, we're at the other end. Over 2,000 years, we've moved from the high conformity end to the high individualism end. And so, for instance, a good representation of this today is Elsa's words from the song Let It Go in Frozen. Don't know how often you've noticed these words, if you know that song. No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. Definition of free meaning no constraints whatsoever. So, as I said, over 2,000 years, our society has moved from one end of the spectrum to the other end. So I would argue that there's not freedom at both ends. You go to the extremes, we actually lose a sense of the value, the reality of freeing constraints. And so at both ends, you don't necessarily see, people don't see the harms, especially the harms they don't want to see. Particularly because this end, let's just say the individualism end, diminishes the sense of mutual obligation we have in society for our well-being, and diminishes the sense of commitment to community and to society at large. And so at this hyper-individualism end of the spectrum, any notion of freeing constraints is abandoned. And of course, both ends of the spectrum produce their own kinds of repression and tyranny. So as Jesus and Paul and the early church, in their context, move people away from the hyper-conformity end of the spectrum, in our context today, we're at the other extreme, and I believe, as Christians, Christ would call us to move us away from this other extreme toward a greater sense of community and mutual obligation to each other in whatever kind of communities and in the broader society we live in. There needs to be recovered a sense that built into human nature are constraints that actually free us for fullest flourishing as God intends for us. There's no algorithm for this. There's no mathematical formula by which to get it right. It's why we struggle with finding the right balance. It's a matter of finding that right balance is a matter of learning and discernment together, while giving space for varying views and cultures. And so I think it's to land somewhere more what did I do there? Here we go. Somewhere more around here, let's say. But the process of figuring this out together is so important. and to say, yes, we do need to have these conversations where we figure this out. And so what happens at both ends of the spectrum, at both extreme ends, is diminishing the opportunity and the acceptability of having these kinds of conversations. So much could be more could be said. I think God's gift of freedom to humanity, reflecting God's own freedom, requires discerning a balance between too much conformity on the one hand and not enough mutual obligation on the other. So much more could be said on so many angles that were mentioned earlier from the floor in terms of freedoms from and freedoms for. But I'm just going to go back for a moment just to summarize kind of the whole series so far. Those 5 angles on humanity in the image of God: responsibility, relationality, rationality, creativity, and freedom. Freedom from sin and harm for our flourishing, individual flourishing and collective flourishing. And so I'm going to end my words there and open up the floor for any thoughts or comments anyone might have.
I'll just pull one from Zoom. It's from the Baileys. It was from before, but it was just, he was saying freedom from despair, cynicism, and apathy.
Great.
Said he, it could have been Rebecca. Could have been both of them.
To
But
Luke
they both.
and Rebecca. Stephen, could you just say those again, please?
Yes, Luke and Rebecca. Freedom from despair, cynicism, apathy.
Terrific. Thank you. Really helpful. Yes, Ed has a comment.
This is continuing with the freedom from. I just want to share a quick story of something that happened to me this week. So freedom from, I think, my default ways of dealing with challenges and problems. That's a real dream for me. My default way of dealing with problems is to think of a solution. And if I can't think of one, to think more, and think more, and think more, and think more. This week, I was going to a hockey game. I had no socks. Those of you who play, you know you need them to play. There was no way I could participate without this equipment. And I tried to think of a solution. That's my default way of solving problems. And there was no way out. There was no way. I was going to play with a new group of players, never saw them before. And I think the Lord helped me in that moment. There was someone who had invited me to this group. And I thought, oh, I'll go to him and I'll just ask for help. I'll see what he can do. You might hear that and think, of course. That was like a revelation for me. And as I moved out of trying to think my way to a solution and trusting this person, this friend who had invited me, I could feel peace coming into my heart where I had anxiety before. So I thank you, Chris, for choosing this theme, this topic. It is very appropriate, very fitting, and I appreciate it. I appreciate you.
Thank you for your story, Ed. Mel. Oh, no, Sarah.
I'm glad that we've sort of seen the 30,000-foot view of the series now. And I think that the image of God for me, these are the different components, but the more that we think about the image of God in other people, the more that we're going to see what Mother Teresa called the distressing disguise of the poor. So she was able to see God in all these people. And the more that we see the image of God in people, the less we are willing to discard them or be okay with them suffering injustice or being killed or all these type of things. And the more that we see the image of God in the people that we don't like, the more that we're able to grow. So that's something I try and do when I meet someone in my clinical practice that I really don't like, is I try to imagine the Jesus in them. And so I'm glad to be talking about the image of God. So thank you, Chris.
Great words. Thank you, Sarah. Very helpful. Yep. Mal has a comment. Mal, we'll get Nair, just because Stephen's closer to Nair, and then we'll come to Mal.
Thanks. It's actually in connection to what Sarah said. I think there can be a freedom to not focus on being right all the time. And that's not to depart from the truth of Scripture and the truth of Jesus, but the freedom to when you're interacting with people to really focus on the image of God and to be curious and kind and relational first. And that's something that I encountered recently, and it can be hard sometimes if you're somebody who likes to be liked, to focus on standing up for other people and knowing that might mean that you're not liked, whether or not you're right or not.
Very helpful. Thank you, Nair. Last comment from Amal.
I would like to ask your thoughts on the words that many Christians think that we should go back to, like the original laws, and what would be your thoughts on considering freeing constraints as being dynamic with the age, with, life?
So you're observing those streams of Christians who want to recover Old Testament law for our own time.
Yes, with more restrictions. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So I think this has commonly been a thing through 2,000 years of Christian history. Periodically, some Christians have wanted to get rid of the Old Testament altogether. Some Christians have wanted to go back to trying to follow it as much as possible. And as Christians, mainstream Christian tradition is that we interpret the Old Testament through the New Testament. And so what that means is some parts of the Old Testament will continue to be valid for Christians, such as, for instance, the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one," and the qualities of God. God is long-suffering, is patient, kindness, and so forth. Other parts as well. Whereas, through the New Testament, we see that other parts of the Old Testament have no validity for Christians anymore. For instance, stoning people for certain offenses. For instance, not marrying Gentiles. I mean, that's pretty difficult for most Christians in the world to do. You're not allowed to marry a Gentile. That no longer applies. And so we have to read the Old Testament through the New Testament. We can't simply accept the Old Testament on its own terms.
Yeah, well, my comment is not really only about the Old Testament, but some church rules. Some people feel that the church became too loose on this subject and on that subject, and therefore we have to go back. And and I would like to know your thoughts on that freedom, the constraints, and how dynamic these constraints should be.
Yeah, I mean, at that abstract level, that would go back to what I said earlier about, and let me just see if I can find those words here, about giving. So it's not a mathematical calculation. It's a discernment together in community that gives space for varying views. For instance, Paul has that comment: some of you do something this way, others do something that way. Give space for each other to do your own thing, as long as you're doing it to the Lord. So there's a clear message there to give space to each other, and then you'll reach a point where, well, actually, you might be going too far. And we in our limited humanity do not have the ability to say, here's the answer to that. We in community, seeking to be faithful to the gospel, to scriptures, discern together where we're going to land. And different communities will land on different places. And there's no way in our humanity to avoid that there will be different outcomes and conclusions. So, thank you. Really helpful comments, so thank you all. Right, so now I invite you to please stand, and we're going to affirm our faith in the words of the Philippians Creed. Jesus, though being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage.